Cleveland may have already made its decision, and the strange part is, I don't think they ever officially announced it. There was no dramatic press conference, no headlines screaming across national television, no public moment where the organization stepped forward and declared that the future had changed. But after spending hours going through Brown's minicamp footage this week, I walked away convinced that something major is happening behind the scenes inside this franchise. And no, I'm not talking about the constant Deshaun Watson speculation that keeps cycling through social media every few weeks. At this point, most Browns fans already understand where that situation is likely heading, regardless of how carefully the organization continues to speak about it publicly. What caught my attention was something far more subtle, something hidden inside the structure of the practices themselves. Because sometimes the biggest NFL stories are not found in transactions, interviews, or rumors. Sometimes they show up in the tiny details teams accidentally reveal when nobody thinks people are paying attention. The Browns released ordinary off-season practice clips, just like every other franchise does this time of year. Most of it looked completely standard at first glance. Quarterbacks throwing scripted routes, receivers jogging through concepts, coaches standing around correcting spacing and timing. The usual off-season content cycle designed to keep fans engaged while real football is still months away. But then, certain patterns started appearing over and over again, and the harder I watched them, the harder they became to ignore. I rewound several clips multiple times because there was something different about the energy surrounding this offense. Not hype, not fake off-season excitement. Structure. Intentional structure. The Browns suddenly look like an organization building around a very specific type of quarterback. Every receiver's skill set, every offensive adjustment, every personnel investment, every developmental decision, it all appears connected now in a way Cleveland honestly hasn't looked in years. And once that realization clicks into place, the entire offseason starts looking completely different. Because this doesn't feel like a team randomly collecting talent anymore. It feels like a front office quietly assembling an offense for a future they may already believe is inevitable. That's why the most important thing I saw during minicamp wasn't a highlight throw or some viral catch floating around social media. It was the way all the pieces suddenly fit together. And the player sitting at the center of that growing picture is Shedeur Sanders. Now, before people overreact, let me make something very clear. Minicamp is not real football. There's no live pass rush, no real defensive chaos, no full-speed contact changing the timing of every throw and route. Anyone trying to sell definitive conclusions from controlled walkthroughs in shorts and helmets is either chasing clicks or ignoring reality. But that doesn't mean minicamp is useless. In fact, if you know what to look for, these practices reveal something incredibly important: preparation. You can tell which players spent months working in silence before cameras ever arrived. You can see who refined details when nobody was watching. That type of work always shows itself early: footwork, timing, route leverage, processing speed, mechanical discipline. Those things cannot be faked through 3 practices in June. They come from long hours behind closed doors, long before reporters show up with cameras. And that's exactly why what happened in Cleveland stood out so much, because hidden underneath all the off-season noise was evidence that this offense may already be evolving into something completely different than what fans expected just a few months ago. And the deeper I looked into the footage, the more one name kept jumping out above everybody else: Denzel Boston. Every single offseason, the exact same cycle repeats across the NFL. A quarterback completes 3 throws in a controlled practice, and suddenly people start throwing around MVP comparisons. A rookie receiver wins 1 drill against backup coverage, and fans convince themselves a superstar has arrived. Meanwhile, 1 bad rep from a veteran somehow becomes proof that a player is washed. The entire minicamp season turns into a giant machine built around overreaction, and honestly, most of it means absolutely nothing. That's the part a lot of people either forget or intentionally ignore.
Minicamp is designed to simulate real football. It is a controlled teaching environment. There's no live pass rush collapsing the pocket, no defensive coordinator disguising pressure packages at full speed, no linebackers trying to take someone's head off across the middle. The physical chaos that defines actual NFL football simply does not exist during these sessions. What you're watching is closer to a structured evaluation lab than a real game environment. And because of that, highlight clips can become incredibly misleading.
A quarterback standing comfortably in a clean pocket during shorts and helmets walkthroughs is not facing anything close to what Sundays actually look like. Receivers are not fighting through true press coverage for 4 quarters. Defensive backs aren't playing with the desperation that comes when roster spots and contracts are truly on the line. Everything is slowed down, everything is controlled, everything is simplified. That's why I always laugh a little when people start making massive declarations after 2 or 3 off-season practices. But here's where things get interesting. Even though minicamp itself is controlled, preparation cannot hide forever. That's the signal most people miss. You may not learn who the best player on the field is during these practices, but you absolutely learn who arrived prepared. You can see who spent the offseason refining technique when nobody was filming. You can spot the players who attacked weaknesses instead of posting workout videos online for attention. Real development leaves fingerprints all over practice tape if you know where to look. Footwork tells stories. Timing tells stories. Route leverage tells stories. So does body control, processing speed, and mechanical consistency. Those details don't magically appear because a coach installed something over 3 walkthroughs in June. They come from months of invisible work done in empty facilities while nobody was watching. And that's exactly why Cleveland caught my attention. Because when I started digging through the Browns footage, I wasn't seeing random off-season energy. I wasn't seeing fake hype designed for social media engagement. I was seeing evidence of preparation that looked unusually intentional. The offense suddenly carried a different shape to it. Certain players looked like they already understood exactly how they fit into a much larger plan. That's what made me stop and rewind certain clips multiple times. Not because somebody made an impossible catch, not because a quarterback launched a deep ball with nobody rushing him. It was the smaller things that stood out. The spacing, the route discipline, the way certain receivers manipulated leverage before breaks, the timing between concepts. The structure felt cleaner, more connected, more purposeful than Cleveland has shown in previous off-seasons. And once I noticed it, one player kept showing up at the center of it over and over again: Denzel Boston. The moment Denzel Boston showed up on the practice footage, the entire offense immediately looked different. And I don't mean different in the exaggerated best shape of his life offseason way that gets recycled every single year. I mean structurally different. The spacing changed, the defensive reactions changed, even the rhythm of the routes looked different once he stepped onto the field. That's when I understood why the Josh Gordon comparisons exploded online almost instantly. Now, to be clear, nobody should be placing those expectations on a young receiver this early. Browns fans know better than anyone how dangerous unrealistic comparisons can become. But at the same time, it's impossible to ignore why people immediately went there. Cleveland has been missing this type of physical presence on the outside for so long that fans almost forgot what it actually looks like when a receiver forces a defense to respect him before the ball is even snapped. Boston has that kind of frame. Long arms, large catch radius, strong movement ability for his size. But the real difference is how defenders react to him. Corners cannot comfortably sit on routes the same way they do against smaller receivers. Safeties have to think differently about leverage. Defensive coordinators are suddenly forced to allocate real attention toward the perimeter instead of crowding everything underneath. And that changes an offense more than most people realize. For years, Cleveland's offense has often felt compressed. Defenses could cheat towards shorter concepts because there wasn't always a true boundary threat consistently forcing coverage adjustments outside the numbers. That creates a ceiling on an offense, even when individual talent exists elsewhere on the roster.
Eventually, everything becomes harder. Third downs become tighter, red zone spacing disappears because defenses no longer fear being punished outside. Boston immediately changes that equation. But honestly, the size wasn't even the most impressive part. What shocked me was how advanced some of the route details already looked this early in his development. Usually when a young receiver with elite physical tools arrives in the NFL, the technical side still looks raw. You see athleticism carrying reps more than true understanding. That wasn't what showed up here. Boston wasn't simply overpowering defenders physically, he was manipulating positioning before breaks even happened. That matters. A lot of casual viewers only watch the ending of a route. They see separation and assume speed created it. Coaches watch the beginning. They watch footwork, stem angles, shoulder positioning, release pacing, tiny details that force defenders into bad leverage before the actual break even occurs. And Boston already showed flashes of understanding those concepts at a level that honestly surprised me.
There were multiple reps where he subtly established tendencies early in the route, then punished defenders once they reacted to those patterns later in the stem. That is not accidental football. That's preparation. That's film study. That's repetition, happening long before rookie minicamp cameras ever started recording. And that's the part people need to understand. 3 practices in June do not create that level of route awareness. Coaches cannot install nuanced leverage manipulation in a few walkthroughs. Those habits are built during lonely off-season work when nobody is watching. Empty training facilities, private receiver sessions, endless repetition against air until movements become automatic. You can always identify the players who took preparation seriously because their details look cleaner immediately. Boston looked like one of those players. The deeper I got into the footage, the more obvious it became that Cleveland may view him as far more than just another developmental receiver buried somewhere on the depth chart. The organization appears to understand exactly what his skill set could unlock for this offense if his growth continues on this trajectory. And this is where the connection to Shedeur Sanders becomes impossible to ignore. Because Boston's strengths perfectly align with the type of quarterback play Sanders thrives with. Tight window anticipation throws, boundary timing routes, back shoulder concepts, isolation coverage opportunities outside the numbers. Suddenly, the offense starts looking designed for precision rather than merely survival. It starts looking like a system built to attack defenses instead of merely reacting to them. That's a massive shift. And honestly, it may explain why Cleveland's offseason suddenly feels far more intentional than people initially realized. But Boston wasn't the only receiver quietly revealing something important during these practices, because another player created a completely different kind of conversation, and the biggest concern surrounding him might end up deciding everything. KC Concepcion. Now this is where the evaluation becomes much more complicated, because unlike Denzel Boston, whose strengths immediately jump off the screen, KC Concepcion forces you to balance 2 completely different realities at the same time. And honestly, that's exactly why the conversation around him could become one of the most important storylines of Cleveland's offseason. Because the drops were real. There's no reason to soften that, no reason to hide behind the usual "it's only minicamp" excuse people love using this time of year. When a receiver drops catchable footballs, quarterbacks notice it immediately, coaches notice it immediately, and over time, it quietly changes the way an offense operates, whether people want to admit it or not. That's the uncomfortable truth about drops in professional football. They don't just hurt individual plays, they damage trust. A quarterback has to believe a receiver will finish the rep when the pressure gets chaotic late in games, especially in critical moments. Third down, red zone, 2-minute drives. If doubt starts creeping into that relationship, play callers naturally become more cautious. Progressions shift, targets disappear. Timing concepts slowly get redirected toward receivers the quarterback trusts more instinctively. And that's why Concepcion's hands are not some tiny issues sitting off to the side.
It's the single biggest obstacle standing directly in front of his development right now. But here's the part that makes this evaluation fascinating. If you focus only on the drops, you completely miss how advanced some other parts of his game already look. Because the route running, that was legitimately impressive. There were several reps during minicamp where Concepcion created separation without relying on overwhelming athleticism at all. He wasn't simply running past defenders, he was manipulating them, setting leverage early, controlling pacing inside the stem, reading coverage alignment before breaks. Those details matter so much more long-term than people realize. One touchdown rep especially stood out to me because it perfectly showed the difference between athletic separation and professional separation. He didn't win because he was dramatically faster than the defender. He won because the route itself worked exactly the way it was designed to work. His release forced the defender into poor positioning. His timing stayed disciplined through the stem. His break created just enough space because the setup before it had already done the damage. That's NFL receiver play. And honestly, coaches usually get far more excited about that than some flashy one-handed catch in practice. Because route intelligence scales upward against better competition. Pure athletic dominance doesn't always survive at the professional level once everybody on the field is fast. Receivers who understand spacing, leverage, and timing can consistently create openings even when they aren't the most explosive athlete in the stadium. Concepcion showed flashes of exactly that. His feet already look coached at a high level, the movement discipline is visible, there's structure to his routes, intentionality. You can tell there's real technical work underneath the surface here. That gives Cleveland something valuable to develop because technical foundations are much harder to teach than people think. The frustrating part is that the hands keep interrupting the excitement.
Every strong route suddenly loses momentum when the football hits the turf. Every impressive separation rep becomes harder to celebrate when the finish isn't there consistently. That tension is what makes Concepcion such a difficult projection right now. Cleveland may genuinely have a highly intelligent separator developing inside this offense, but until the drops stabilize, the trust level can never fully grow. And trust is everything for a young quarterback, especially for someone like Shedeur Sanders, whose game thrives on timing and anticipation. Precision quarterbacks throw before breaks fully develop. They release passes based on expectation. That system completely falls apart if receivers become unreliable at the catch point. So now Cleveland faces an extremely important question moving forward. Can Concepcion clean up the one weakness capable of limiting everything else he already does well? Because if the answer becomes yes, the Browns may suddenly have a receiver room with dramatically more flexibility than people expected entering the offseason. Boston gives them physical boundary pressure. Concepcion gives them movement and spacing intelligence underneath, and together, those skill sets start creating problems defenses actually have to solve. But while fans were debating receivers online, another storyline quietly started spiraling completely out of control across Browns media. And honestly, I think people are getting way ahead of themselves with it. Talon Green. The internet did exactly what the internet always does the second Talon Green flashed a few exciting plays during Browns minicamp. Clips started spreading everywhere. Fans began talking themselves into wild possibilities. Some people even started hinting that Cleveland might suddenly have a quarterback controversy developing behind the scenes. And this is the point where the conversation needs to slow down dramatically. Because while Green absolutely showed intriguing flashes, there's a huge difference between interesting developmental traits and serious starting quarterback conversation. Right now, those two things are being blended together online in ways that honestly do not match the actual reality of where he currently sits as a player. Now let me be fair first, because ignoring the talent would be dishonest. The physical tools are obvious immediately. The arm strength is real. The mobility changes the geometry of the field in ways traditional pocket passers simply cannot replicate. You can feel the athletic explosiveness the second he starts moving through drills.
Even during controlled practice sessions, there were moments where the raw upside jumped off the screen hard enough to understand why fans got excited so quickly. Quarterbacks with that kind of movement ability naturally create attention. They create imagination. Fans start visualizing broken plays turning into explosive gains. Coaches start thinking about designed movement packages. Suddenly, every scramble drill clip becomes fuel for bigger conversations. But this is exactly where off-season overreaction becomes dangerous, because the same footage generating excitement also revealed why Green remains a long-term developmental project rather than an immediate solution. The release mechanics still needs serious refinement. The throwing motion occasionally gets elongated under pressure simulation. Certain passes sailed high. Some throws arrived late. A few reps showed the exact kind of inconsistency you typically expect from a quarterback still learning how to translate raw athletic gifts into stable professional quarterback mechanics. And honestly, that's completely normal. There's no shame in that evaluation at all. Green was never drafted as a polished NFL-ready passer expected to challenge for a starting role immediately. He was drafted because the upside is fascinating enough to justify investing time into development. That's a very different conversation than pretending he's suddenly forcing Cleveland to rethink the structure of the franchise after a few controlled walkthrough sessions. Because he isn't. And I think that distinction matters a lot right now, before the hype grows larger than the actual evidence. Some media coverage has already started drifting toward the kind of exaggerated off-season narrative that tends to explode this time of year. One exciting throw becomes buzz, buzz becomes pressure, pressure becomes fake quarterback competition rumors. Then suddenly fans are debating scenarios that were never realistically happening inside the building to begin with. That's exactly the cycle Cleveland needs to avoid. Because when you step back and examine the Browns' offseason as a whole, the organization's direction actually looks extremely clear. Everything points towards Shedeur Sanders. The receiver acquisitions fit his skill set. The offensive line investments fit his style of play. The route concepts emerging during minicamp fit precision timing football. Even the structural balance of the offense increasingly looks designed around maximizing a quarterback who thrives on anticipation, accuracy, and processing speed, rather than chaos-driven improvisation. That doesn't mean Green lacks value.
In fact, his development could become extremely important long-term. Athletic quarterbacks with legitimate arm talent are always worth monitoring because growth trajectories at that position can become unpredictable over time. If Cleveland properly develops his mechanics and decision-making foundation, there may absolutely be something worth getting excited about down the road. But there's a massive difference between worth monitoring and threatening the organizational plan. Right now, Green belongs firmly in the first category. And honestly, the Browns themselves seem to understand that perfectly well. Nothing about their off-season behavior suggests uncertainty at quarterback anymore. Quite the opposite, actually. The deeper you examine their roster construction, the more it feels like Cleveland quietly committed to a direction long before fans fully realized it. That's why I keep coming back to the bigger picture instead of individual practice highlights. Because Boston's arrival wasn't random. Concepcion's fit wasn't random either. None of these moves feel disconnected anymore. They feel coordinated, deliberate, like pieces of a much larger offensive identity being assembled step by step behind the scenes. And once you start connecting those dots together, the Browns' entire offseason suddenly starts making a lot more sense. The deeper you dig into Cleveland's offseason, the harder it becomes to believe these moves were made independently of one another. At first, a lot of people treated them like ordinary roster adjustments. Add a receiver here, reinforce protection there, bring in developmental depth at quarterback, standard offseason behavior. But once you step back and examine everything together instead of piece by piece, a completely different picture starts forming. This looks like an offense being engineered around a very specific vision. And honestly, that realization changes the way you interpret almost everything the Browns have done over the last several months. Start with Denzel Boston.
His presence directly addresses one of the biggest structural weaknesses this offense has quietly carried for years. Cleveland has lacked a true physical boundary receiver capable of forcing defensive coordinators to allocate serious attention outside the numbers. That absence compresses an offense over time. Defenses become comfortable crowding intermediate zones because they don't fear consistently losing isolated matchups on the perimeter. Boston changes that immediately, not just because of size, but because his skill set creates stress on coverage structure itself. Defenses now have to think differently about leverage, safety rotation, and isolation help. Suddenly, the field expands horizontally in ways that open opportunities underneath for timing concepts and intermediate spacing routes. Now look at KC Concepcion. His game fits almost perfectly into the spaces Boston helps create. While Boston pressures defenses vertically and physically outside, Concepcion thrives through timing, separation mechanics, and movement intelligence in intermediate areas. Even with the drop concerns, the technical route foundation is obvious. He understands how to create throwing windows instead of simply waiting for athleticism to generate them. That pairing matters, because when you combine a legitimate boundary presence with intelligent underneath route movement, you suddenly create the exact type of offensive ecosystem precision quarterbacks tend to thrive inside. And that's where the bigger organizational picture becomes impossible to ignore. Everything keeps circling back towards Shedeur Sanders. The Browns didn't just add random talent this offseason. They added pieces that specifically complement the strengths Sanders is known for: timing throws, anticipation windows, rhythm passing, boundary accuracy, controlled pocket operation. Even the offensive line investments suddenly make far more sense through that lens. Think about how much money and effort Cleveland poured into stabilizing protection. That's not the behavior of a franchise planning to survive through chaotic backyard football. That's the behavior of an organization trying to create a clean, operational structure around a quarterback they believe can dissect defenses when properly protected. Stable pockets matter enormously for quarterbacks whose greatest strengths come from processing and precision rather than constant improvisation. And honestly, when you connect all these moves together, the Browns suddenly stop looking confused. That's the biggest difference I noticed watching this minicamp footage compared to previous Cleveland offseasons. For years, the franchise often felt reactive. One season would end, and the next offseason felt like another attempt to patch visible holes without a fully coherent identity underneath it all. Random fixes, constant reshuffling, different philosophies colliding together year after year. This feels different. Now the roster construction actually appears aligned. The receiver room complements itself, the protection philosophy complements the quarterback style, even the developmental projects fit into clearly defined roles instead of existing as disconnected experiments. That's not accidental roster building, that's organizational commitment. And I think fans are starting to quietly recognize that, even if the franchise itself continues speaking carefully in public. There's been growing speculation online that Cleveland's internal direction may already be far more settled than its external messaging suggests. To be clear, a lot of that remains speculation right now, and the organization obviously has reasons for handling things cautiously. But when you evaluate behavior instead of press conference language, the signals become difficult to ignore, because teams reveal what they truly believe through investment patterns, where they spend money, which player archetypes they prioritize, what skill sets they suddenly begin surrounding a roster with. Those decisions usually tell the truth long before official statements ever do.
And Cleveland's offseason tells a very specific story. A story about infrastructure. A story about building an offense intentionally instead of desperately. A story about a franchise that may finally believe it has identified the quarterback profile capable of carrying the organization into a completely different era. And once you see that pattern clearly, one thing becomes impossible to ignore. The Browns may already be operating like the post-Watson future has quietly begun behind the scenes. There's one part of this entire Cleveland minicamp story that I honestly think national coverage is completely missing right now. Everyone keeps focusing on isolated highlights, one throw, one catch, one viral practice clip. But the real signal hiding underneath all of this has nothing to do with individual moments. It has to do with organizational behavior. Because for the first time in a long time, the Browns actually look aligned. And if you've watched the NFL long enough, you know how rare that really is. Most struggling franchises spend years trapped in constant identity changes. One coaching staff wants one style of offense, the next front office wants something completely different. Quarterbacks get drafted for systems that disappear 2 seasons later. Receivers are acquired without fitting the larger structure. Protection schemes constantly shift, nothing connects cleanly, so development never stabilizes. That cycle destroys franchises quietly over time. Players stop developing properly because the environment around them keeps changing faster than they can adapt. Young quarterbacks enter unstable situations with mismatched personnel. Offensive systems become patchwork collections of disconnected ideas instead of coherent structures designed to maximize strengths. For years, Cleveland flirted dangerously close to that exact problem, but this offseason feels fundamentally different. The hidden signal isn't hype, it's coherence. Every move suddenly appears connected to a larger football philosophy. The receivers fit together stylistically, the offensive line investments fit the quarterback profile. Even the developmental depth pieces feel chosen with intentionality instead of desperation. That kind of structural alignment matters far more long-term than any single minicamp highlight ever could. And honestly, you can see it showing up in the body language of the offense already. The spacing looks cleaner, the timing looks more natural. Players appear to understand where they fit within the larger structure, instead of operating like isolated pieces trying to survive on raw talent alone. That usually only happens when an organization has clarity internally about what it wants to become. That's the part nobody's talking about enough. People keep debating whether certain players will succeed individually, but the more important story may be that Cleveland finally seems to understand exactly what kind of offense it's trying to build in the first place. That realization changes everything, because successful franchises almost never emerge from chaos overnight. Before the wins arrive, structure arrives first, identity arrives first. The roster starts making sense before the scoreboard fully catches up. You can usually spot the early stages of real organizational growth by watching whether player acquisitions complement one another or compete against one another philosophically. Right now, Cleveland's moves complement each other almost perfectly. Denzel Boston brings physical perimeter pressure. KC Concepcion creates separation and timing flexibility underneath. The offensive line investments stabilize interior protection. The quarterback room now contains developmental balance instead of complete uncertainty. Even the coaching approach during minicamp felt more focused on system installation than random experimentation. That's not what disorganized teams look like. And honestly, I think that's why so many Browns fans suddenly feel cautiously optimistic, even if they can't fully explain why yet. It's not just about talent. Cleveland has talented rosters before. This feels different because the roster finally appears to have direction attached to it. There's also something else worth paying attention to here. The Browns no longer look like a franchise building week to week. They look like a franchise building for sustainability. That's a massive psychological shift for an organization that has spent years trapped inside short-term pressure cycles and emergency fixes. Instead of throwing random solutions at visible problems, they appear to be constructing layers of support around a quarterback archetype they genuinely believe in. And when franchises reach that stage internally, the public usually notices much later than the people inside the building do. That's why I keep saying the biggest minicamp takeaway wasn't a flashy throw or viral highlight. It was the realization that Cleveland may already know exactly who and what it wants to become moving forward. And if that's true, then the pressure surrounding Shedeur Sanders just became enormous.
Here's the part of this entire conversation that becomes dangerous very quickly for Shedeur Sanders. The moment a franchise starts building visible infrastructure around a quarterback, expectations immediately change. Fans stop treating him like a developmental possibility and start treating him like the answer. And once that shift happens, the pressure becomes completely different. That's exactly where Cleveland appears to be heading right now.
Because if the Browns are truly constructing this offense around Sanders' strengths the way it currently looks, then the organization is no longer quietly experimenting. It's investing belief, real belief, the kind that changes timelines, the kind that reshapes roster construction, the kind that tells an entire franchise internally, this is the direction we're moving. And whether people realize it or not, that creates enormous weight for a young quarterback before he's even fully established himself at the professional level. Suddenly, every throw gets analyzed differently. Every practice rep carries bigger meaning. Fans begin searching for confirmation that the organization made the right choice. Media coverage becomes amplified. Expectations start growing faster than development naturally happens. And in Cleveland specifically, where quarterback instability has haunted the franchise for years, that pressure multiplies even faster. Because Browns fans desperately want this to finally be the answer, that emotional reality matters. When a fan base spends years cycling through uncertainty at the most important position in sports, hope becomes incredibly powerful. The second people believe they see stability forming, they emotionally attach themselves to it almost immediately. That's already starting to happen with Sanders. You can feel it building online. Every minicamp clip spreads instantly. Every positive report gets magnified. Every sign of chemistry becomes evidence supporting a future people badly want to believe in. But there's a difficult side to that excitement too. The faster expectations rise, the smaller the margin for normal development struggles becomes. Young quarterbacks almost always face turbulence early in their careers. Timing adjustments, coverage disguises, protection breakdowns, confidence swings, bad stretches. That's normal NFL development. But once fans convince themselves a player is already the centerpiece of an offensive turnaround, patience becomes much harder to maintain during those inevitable difficult moments. And honestly, Cleveland's offseason moves may have accelerated that pressure significantly, because now the excuses start disappearing. If the offensive line is improved, people expect cleaner quarterback play. If the receiver room suddenly looks more tailored to Sanders' strengths, fans expect faster offensive growth. If the organization appears aligned philosophically, people stop blaming dysfunction and start evaluating the quarterback directly. That's the trade-off that comes with organizational commitment. The support structure rises, but so do the expectations attached to it. And this is why I think the Browns are entering one of the most important transitional periods the franchise has faced in years. Not because minicamp itself determines anything definitive, but because the underlying signals suggest Cleveland may already be emotionally and structurally moving toward a completely new era internally. You can feel it in the way the offense is being assembled. You can feel it in the way certain players are being prioritized. And honestly, you can feel it in the way fans are reacting already. There's growing belief that Sanders is no longer simply part of the future. More and more people are starting to view him as the future. That's a massive psychological leap for a franchise. Once that switch flips publicly, everything surrounding the quarterback position becomes magnified. Every success becomes proof. Every mistake becomes fear. And if we're being completely honest, that pressure can either create stars or completely overwhelm players before they're ready for it. That's why I keep coming back to the same thought after watching all this Browns minicamp footage. The biggest story isn't really about one player. It's about the possibility that Cleveland may have quietly reached organizational clarity for the first time in a very long time. Because when you strip away the offseason noise, the rumors, the debates, and the endless social media reactions, the Browns suddenly look like a franchise moving in one unified direction.
And if that direction truly centers around Shedeur Sanders, then Cleveland may have already made the most important decision of its entire future long before the public officially hears the words out loud.
When people look back at this offseason months from now, they may remember the viral clips, the practice highlights, the endless debates online about quarterbacks, receivers, and minicamp overreactions. But honestly, I think the real story was something much quieter than that, something hiding underneath all the noise the entire time. Because what Cleveland revealed during these practices wasn't just talent, it was direction. That's the word I keep coming back to after watching all of this unfold. Direction. For the first time in years, the Browns no longer look like a franchise throwing random solutions at permanent problems. The roster construction finally appears connected. The offensive philosophy finally appears coherent. The developmental pieces actually complement one another instead of pulling the offense in different directions. And once you notice that, the entire offseason suddenly starts feeling less accidental. Denzel Boston wasn't just another receiver addition. He looks like a direct answer to a structural weakness that has limited this offense for years. KC Concepcion wasn't just brought in for speed or depth. His movement intelligence fits perfectly into the kind of timing-based spacing attack Cleveland suddenly appears interested in building. Even the offensive line investments now look less like generic protection spending and more like intentional infrastructure being placed around a quarterback archetype the organization believes can succeed at a high level. And every road keeps leading back to Shedeur Sanders. That's what makes this entire situation feel so important. Not because the Browns publicly declared anything dramatic, they haven't. Not because one minicamp practice suddenly proves future success, it doesn't. And not because rumors online automatically equal truth. A lot of speculation surrounding Cleveland right now remains exactly that, speculation. But organizations reveal themselves through behavior long before they reveal themselves through words. And Cleveland's behavior this offseason has been incredibly revealing. The player archetypes they targeted, the structure of the offense being assembled, the specific skill sets now appearing around the quarterback room. None of it feels random anymore. It feels coordinated, like a franchise quietly preparing for a future it may already believe is coming, whether the public fully realizes it yet or not. That's why I think the biggest takeaway from Cleveland minicamp had nothing to do with statistics, highlight throws, or viral social media reactions. It was the realization that Cleveland suddenly looks like a franchise operating with internal clarity. And if that clarity truly centers around Shedeur Sanders, then the pressure, expectations, and stakes surrounding this team are about to rise dramatically moving forward. Because once a franchise emotionally commits to a quarterback, everything changes. Timelines change, patience changes, expectations change. Fans stop hoping for improvement and start expecting transformation. That's the stage Cleveland may already be entering right now, quietly, carefully, without officially announcing it. And if all the signals hiding inside this offseason actually mean what they appear to mean, then the Browns may have already made the biggest decision in franchise history long before the public ever hears the truth out loud.